All right. So Ken, let's start with this question. The question is, what is one point of leverage that you think most organizations don't see or they overlook that if they actually paid attention to it could have a significant impact on their organization?
Wayne, that's an interesting question because to me, the answer to that is one word, which is culture. And it's funny because over the years, we've talked about culture in any kind of business, really. It doesn't matter. My particular area has been medical practices, but culture is that singular factor that really serves as the foundation for an organization. If the culture isn't right, the organization will never work. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but it's not going to work. Culture. That's the secret sauce for organizational success, I believe.
Gotcha. Well, this is Ken Hertz. Ken is joining us today from Trophy Club, Texas. And Ken and I have known each other for, I'm guessing, 15-ish years, give or take.
Yeah, sure.
As I think luck would have it, I think we were frequenting the same coffee shop and over time met each other. I think it actually had to do with the fact that every time I saw Ken, he had a stack of interesting books with him. And so I think that actually kind of began the dialogue and began the conversation. Ken has worked in the medical industry for years. I'll let him kind of fill us in a little bit about that, doing consulting all over the country, working with them on their organizations, better management inside their organizations. So Ken, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and out of your schedule to be here.
Wayne, happy to do it. It's really great to see you. Yeah, we would spend every morning at Tamp and Grind having coffee, and we got into conversations and we talked about books, we talked about journals, and we talked about pens. And then I made the mistake of listening to you and going from my Dell computer to to MacBook. I drank the Kool-Aid and it's been downhill ever since.
Absolutely. Well, tell everybody a little bit kind of about your background in the medical field and kind of what you're doing now.
So now let me start with where I am today. Right now, I'm working as an independent consultant, and I'm working with a variety of practices of all shapes and sizes, frankly. I'm doing a lot of executive search work. It's interesting. This seems to be a transition time in medical practices where they're bringing in new administrators, new chief operating officers. In addition to that, I do a lot of work on strategic planning, cultural development, governance, operational work, marketing. I mean, over the years, you've been a great resource and help to me in learning more about marketing and its impact on medical practices. And so it's kind of a broad-based practice. And as you said, around the country, and I've been doing a lot of presentations as well. So all things considered, having a good time. Prior to that, I worked for an organization called MGMA, Medical Group Management Association, which is kind of the standard bearer for medical practices around the country for about 10 or 12 years as a consultant. And then prior to that, managed practices. And then way back before you and Heather were ever born, I managed symphonies and ballets and actually did a lot of work in the not-for-profit sector as well, working on strategic planning and governance and things like that.
Yeah, and that would have been back in Atlanta days, I believe. Is that?
Yeah, Atlanta days, Tulsa days.
Tulsa was pre-Atlanta.
And Cape Cod days.
Yeah. So how did you, I guess, progress into the medical field? What kind of led that transition from your nonprofit work over into the medical field?
You know, it's interesting, Wayne. while I was in the not-for-profit world, the arts world, I'd meet people and somebody would say, oh, I used to be a banker, or I used to be a CPA, and that kind of thing. And it made me think that, maybe you don't have to stay in one particular field. And I guess, and I don't remember what the literature says, but it says most of us go through several different industries or careers over the course of our life. But when, let's see, I guess when I worked with the New Orleans Symphony, boy, when my work with the New Orleans Symphony ended, we ended up closing the symphony down for a while, lack of community support. I liked New Orleans, wanted to stay there. And so I did some networking. And through networking, I talked to a lot of people in a lot of different fields. And there was a doctor who took a chance on me and hired me to manage his practice. And so that's kind of how I made that shift. And, the thing is, Wayne, that it almost doesn't matter. There's certain things that are transferable: human resource skills, finance, accounting, management, leadership. It doesn't matter what industry you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as you kind of progressed into the medical field, and as you were just saying, the similarities are transferable between industries. What would you say have been some trends as it relates to both the challenges faced in that industry, and then also kind of the opportunities as it's progressed over these last several years and even last couple of decades, probably?
Well, so healthcare has gone through a lot of changes, and there are always physicians and practices within the field that take advantage of
UPS man.
That's my bodyguard.
He didn't like the question.
He did. Hank, did you not like that question? There have been a lot of changes, but what we're seeing now is a lot more in the way of technology. Certainly in actually very recent months, the acceleration and use of, for instance, televisits and virtual visits. It's something that's been hanging out there for years, but nobody really got into. And all of a sudden, it's really taken off. So we're seeing technology. We're seeing technology in the billing and collection work as well for practices. Another big trend, is he annoying?
It's completely fine.
Okay. We're seeing trends in teams now working together. It used to be the doctor and everybody else. Now we're seeing teams of the doctor, an advanced practitioner, the nurse, all work together as a team. So when you or I go into an office, there's a group of people that are responsible for our care. And we're seeing more sophisticated organizations. We're seeing a lot of consolidation in practices because it's becoming increasingly difficult to survive on your own. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple of the trends, I think, that we're seeing in healthcare.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of telehealth or telemedicine has been around for quite some time. And from kind of my outside, ignorant perspective, what I've noticed is, and it could be just a regional thing, but the adoption of it has been fairly slow. And with this pandemic, with COVID and everything going on surrounding that, it's kind of sped up that adoption curve. Is that accurate or inaccurate, or?
100% accurate. That's exactly what it was. It was sitting there and kind of plodding along, bump, ba-bump, ba-bump, ba-bump. Nobody got very excited about it. Now, one of the reasons nobody got excited about it is there wasn't really a solid way of compensating for it. And, it's always follow the money.
Yeah, sure.
And so with the virus and the pandemic, all of a sudden now, virtual visits, telehealth, telemedicine became reimbursable.
Mm,
And physicians found that if they wanted to maintain contact with you or I as patients, that's a way to do it. And it's a
sure.
way to protect them and protect the patient. And for some of the doctors, even, so suppose you have a 65, 66-year-old doctor that has diabetes, that has a heart condition, he could work from home and see televisits.
Sure.
And so we were able to keep things moving and keep healthcare ongoing. So you're right, absolutely.
And just from your perspective, you have got a unique perspective in that you get to observe and work with a lot of different practices and a lot of different specializations. Is telehealth, in terms of moving that direction, you view that as a positive across kind of the health industry?
Yeah, I think Wayne, it's very positive. And everything that I'm reading and with talking with people, it's going to stay. It may not be as active as it's being right now, but I think it's going to continue because the systems have been put in place, and we've been able to move it forward. So I think we're going to continue to see that.
Yeah, and I think what that illustrates is that, oftentimes it's in spite of the crisis, in spite of the quote unquote negative things that are taking place in an industry or around the world in this case, there are silver linings that come out of those things. And would you say that it's true that, the ones who are already leaning in that direction and making strides in that direction were ahead? So in other words, once the pandemic kind of hit and realized that the shift had to take place, the ones who had already kind of been moving that direction and adopting that were way ahead of the curve. Is that pretty
Yeah,
accurate?
exactly. They had adopted it, although in a very limited kind of way, but they had the technology set up. They
Mm,
had established that. And so for them, they just turned it up a notch.
yeah.
The old Emerald Bam, and and,
It's roll
and
it
they
out.
were, yeah, and they were able to take it up a notch, and because they already had that technology in place. The other groups had to go, what do we do? What kind of technology what do we even need to use? How do we
Mm-hmm.
do this? And so for them, they had that lead time where it took that. So, um, to your point, from a practice, you've always got to be looking ahead, and you've
Yeah.
always got to be looking at opportunities out there. Shame on us if we only focus inside and internally and
Right.
aren't seeing what's happening out there.
Yeah, I would imagine in a lot of ways it's like, those who were so in love with the fax machine, and when email came along, there was no way that email would replace the fax machine. They just couldn't fathom that, this thing online could replace what was there. And so those who held on, so strongly to what worked in the past and what they were comfortable with, kind of got left behind in a lot of ways by those who were early adopters, or at least on the front end of the mass adoption of email.
You talk about that, and fax is interesting because there are still a lot of practices that have maintained fax forever and ever and ever, and there are all sorts of HIPAA issues with it, and just a broad range of issues related to fax. I mean, when you even went to the notion of a fax server and
Mm-hmm.
and those kinds of things, I mean, it blew people's minds. So you're right. The people that get stuck in the "this is the way we've always done it" mode, uh, it ain't your father's Buick. I mean, you got to jump ahead.
Right. Absolutely. One question, as you take that unique perspective that you get, and it's working literally across the country with people and consulting with people from all over in the medical field, have you identified or picked up on any characteristics or any traits between what you would say is a good running practice? In other words, from a systems and processes and flow and culture, as you talked about at the very beginning, are there any characteristics or traits that are common amongst the ones that work well, function well, and those who don't? So, are there any kind of opposing things that stand out, the differences between the good ones and the bad ones, for lack of a better term?
Wayne, I think there are probably 2 or 3 key factors that differentiate those. One would be, and I had a colleague tell me this 1,000 years ago when I went from the symphony to managing a practice, and he had been a consultant in medical practices, and he said, you're going to want to focus on everything inside. He said, spend some time there, but you have to focus externally on what's happening outside of the practice. And so I think, first of all, those groups, Wayne, that spend so much time focused on what's going on in their own little room, their own little box, they're missing what's going on in the outside world. They're missing the telehealth and the telemedicine that was starting a couple of years ago. They're missing some of the technology for texting patients and reminder systems. So one is certainly an external focus versus an inward focus. That's really key.
Yeah.
A second one, I think, Wayne, is the culture, and we talked about that at the outset. I think the practices are successful that focus on their culture, that pay attention to their culture. And I've got a couple of thoughts about that maybe we'll talk about in a little bit, related to a book that I think is really interesting. But culture, the successful ones focus on developing that culture. The ones that are not successful ignore the culture. And we know generally, at least empirically, if not even in real case studies, the notion that culture eats strategy every day. I mean, you read that in 1,000 strategy books. And, it sounds like, okay, maybe it's true. So culture, external versus internal. And the third, I think, is accountability. And accountability, to me, Wayne, is a broad concept. Accountability means not only you holding me accountable for what I said I would do, but accountability, I think, is also you delegating to me or empowering me to do certain things and then holding me accountable for it. Those organizations that are successful have a culture, back to that word, of accountability. Those that do not hold people accountable are not successful. Those are 3, I think, really key foundational things that make a huge difference in an organization's success or not.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, even though your first point, which is kind of having that external focus versus the internal, in the business world, there's the old adage, work on the business, not in the business. Exactly. And I know where you were talking slightly different than that, but I think there's that overarching element, which is, it's not just about the patients who come in terms of, what we're doing in the rooms. But it's also, like you said, it's the attention to the quote unquote practice or the business itself. It's the own the business things. It's the culture. It's the accountability. It's making sure we are devoting time to watching what's taking place in the market and in the world, so we can adapt and adopt what changes are coming along.
That's key. Work on the business, not just in the business, and it works for anything and everything. That's key. Thank you. That's a great point.
When you're coming into practices, typically, who are you typically working with? Is it typically the physicians? Is it the office managers? Like, where do you come in, and kind of who do you work with when you're in these organizations?
So not in most cases, I'm generally contacted by either a physician or an administrator. Mm-hmm. Once I get into the practice, I'm typically going to work with everybody in the practice. So if I do an operational assessment, I'm going to work with the staff, the people that are processing everything, the frontline people, as well as the management people, as well as understanding from the physicians what their issues are. If I do strategic planning, if I do governance, the searches that I'm doing now, I was brought into those searches by an administrator, but I start out working with the physician owners because they're the ones that call the shots. And so to your point, my goal, my mission is to get them to understand that they need to work on their practice, not just in their practice. And for some of them, that's hard because for some of them, they just want to be a doctor. I just want to see patients. Yeah. Don't bother me with the other stuff.
Yeah, no, it is that tug. I mean, it's the tug of the doing the thing is sure. Where so much reward is, and so much, and often in their cases, it's where the money comes from, when you're actually seeing the patients or doing the operations or the surgeries. So kind of as we wrap up, a couple of closing questions for you. One would be, is there a particular book that you think that all leaders within organizations could benefit from reading?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a really hard question. and I'm that guy that never says, well, there's just really one book. But given that we've been really talking a lot about culture, one of the books that was actually suggested to me by a friend who's recently gotten his PhD in organizational development and out from Pepperdine, really interesting guy. Actually spent time living in Alexandria for a number of years, former military, taught at West Point for a while. Really interesting. It's a book called An Everyone Culture. And it's by Robert Keegan and Lisa Lasko-Leahy. And I guess what I found so interesting in it, we talk about, Wayne, our employees being our greatest resource, right? Our employees are our greatest resource. And then if you ask the question, well, what do you do to develop your resource? Well, they're our greatest resource. If you ask me what I do to cultivate my garden, I'm going to tell you I'm fertilizing it every 2 weeks and I'm watering it and I'm pruning it. And by the way, not just 1 or 2 bushes that I think are pretty, but all of the bushes, all of the flowers. And so what An Everyone Culture does is it says, look, let's talk about organizational development or a developmental organization in a totally different way. And let's say if each of us individually becomes better and grows, each of us individually and personally, then the organization will grow to be better. Now, it's got a whole framework. It's got all sorts of acronyms and various ways of doing it. And it may be that you read a book like this and you come away going, I can't do all those acronyms and things, but the philosophy, the approach, Wayne, that says, I'm going to work on developing each individual in the organization to get them to be the very best that they can be, then the organization will prosper. I think it's a fascinating book.
Yeah, that's interesting.
A couple of years ago.
You said everyone culture?
An Everyone Culture, becoming a deliberately developmental organization.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I won't say the saying right, but it's the saying around, if you're unintentional, then you're intentionally neglecting your intent. There's a great saying.
Yes,
And
exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
you have to be intentional in developing the culture. It doesn't happen out, an accident. It won't happen on its own. It's
No,
intentionality.
absolutely.
And then one last question, and it may be the same book, but is there a particular book that you are reading currently that you're enjoying and maybe have a takeaway?
So it's an interesting book. It has nothing to do with leadership or management, except that it does. Um, we're in the midst of this pandemic. And there was a book written a number of years ago called The Great Influenza by John Barry. And he wrote a book about rising tide related to Katrina and what happened in New Orleans. But I've started reading that, and it's just fascinating because it is about management. It is about leadership throughout its pages. But it really talks about how 100 years ago, the country, and in fact the world, dealt with what was, up until that time, the most serious pandemic the world had ever seen. And there was a quote in there that I just loved, and it was by an English scientist by the name of Thomas Huxley, and it was delivered in a speech in 1876. But I loved it, and it's interesting because the quote is, he talks about the fact that in his mind, learning really has a purpose. I mean, there's some people that learn just to learn, but he said learning has a purpose. And then he said, the great end of life is not knowledge, but action.
Yeah. No,
I mean, it's just a few short little words, but that captures it.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And the name of that book again is?
The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. And I picked it up because I thought it might be instructive given the times we're currently living in.
Absolutely. Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and out of your day to join us. For those watching who want to learn more about you or get in contact with you, how can they go about doing that, or where should they go?
The easiest way, Wayne, is through email, and it would be Ken, Ken, at KTH Health, HEALTH, CON.com.
Got it. We'll type that out in the description as well, so make it a little easier for people to get that as well. Well, thanks again for taking the time. I've enjoyed catching up with you and appreciate you taking the time to share with everyone.
My great pleasure, Wayne. Thank you for asking and inviting me. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much.